January 21, 1944. Over the outskirts of Brunswick, Germany. Inside the tightening box of an American bomber formation, a single-tail gunner fought a battle that no one else could see. The formation was already deep into hostile airspace when the first warning crackled through the interphone. German fighters were rising fast, climbing in disciplined waves toward the rear elements, the place where every formation lived or died. At the very back of 1B-24, the tail gunner braced himself for the impact of the attack. He reached for his twin .50 caliber Brownings, expecting the familiar mechanical rhythm of metal feeding into steel. Instead, the belt jammed. He pulled again. Nothing. Ahead of him, the German fighters were closing in, the seconds thinning out, the formation tightening in desperation as the escorts drifted out of range. The gunner knew the rear position was now exposed, the weak point in a wall that protected dozens of airmen. Every bomber ahead depended on the guns behind them. He kept his eyes locked on the approaching threat as he wrestled the belt free, knowing the formation's survival tightened around this single moment. American daylight bombing in 1944 revolved around a single belief: if the United States could keep pushing deep into German airspace, the war's industrial backbone would eventually crack. It was a strategy built on boldness, mass, and the idea that disciplined formations of heavy bombers could fight their way to the target and back. But every mile beyond friendly lines carried a price. The Luftwaffe understood the rhythm of these raids, learned the routes, and refined attack patterns that focused on one vulnerable point: the rear. Inside this vast campaign, tail gunners became the unseen guardians of American air power. Their job demanded total awareness. They watched the sky behind the formation, a space where danger could appear without warning. The tail guns were not symbolic. They were the last wall between approaching fighters and the dozens of men locked inside the formation ahead. A jam, a delay, or a moment of hesitation could open a seam that the enemy knew how to exploit. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had grown stronger, but the Luftwaffe still held the advantage in coordination and proximity. German fighter groups near Brunswick had perfected a method aimed specifically at the American rear. They launched in staggered elements, timing their climbs so they arrived just as escort fighters reached their fuel limits and peeled away. When that happened, the American formation had only itself to rely on. Every turret, every gunner, every belt of ammunition mattered. The mission toward Brunswick that morning was typical of the wider campaign. The target lay deep within a region protected by radar stations, flak belts, and fighter airfields. The bomber groups assembling over England received the standard briefing: expect resistance, expect pressure, expect repeated attacks from the rear. Tail gunners studied the identification silhouettes of enemy aircraft, memorizing shapes and angles. A Ju-88 rushing in from low 6 looked different from an FW-190 climbing at high 12, but both knew the same truth: if they could break the back of a formation, they could break the mission. The pressure on these positions grew heavier as the months passed. Gunners faced not only the enemy but also the mechanical limits of the weapons they relied on. The .50 caliber Brownings were reliable, but reliability depended on maintenance, temperature, vibration, and clean ammunition. A twisted link or stiff feed could slow everything down. Crews checked their belts before takeoff, feeding them by hand under dim lights, but long flights, shifting angles, and sudden evasive maneuvers could still disrupt the line. On the Brunswick route, the formation understood what awaited them. The Luftwaffe had been increasingly aggressive in defending industrial centers in this region. American crews reported coordinated attacks that struck with precision and speed. The opening stage of these engagements often determined how the rest of the mission unfolded. If the rear was weakened early, the formation's defensive shape could collapse. The enemy counted on exactly that. As the B-24s crossed deeper into Germany, the tension inside the aircraft rose. Every gunner scanned his arc, waiting for the first sign of movement. The tail gunner, isolated in his narrow compartment, knew that he was the first line of warning and the last line of defense. If fighters broke through to his position, the rest of the formation would feel the impact seconds later. He carried responsibility not for one aircraft but for the entire column behind him. That morning, the formation stayed tight, maintaining the disciplined geometry that protected each bomber. But even perfect alignment could not erase the reality of range limits. Escorts would eventually turn back, leaving the bombers exposed during the most dangerous phase of the mission. Everyone on board understood this rhythm. Everyone understood the moment when the air suddenly felt larger around them. In that widening space, the gunner prepared himself. He checked his guns, the feed, the alignment. He had done this dozens of times, each repetition a quiet ritual that made the difference between readiness and disaster. Nothing about the upcoming attack would be gentle. The German fighters were climbing with purpose, and once they committed, the battle would unfold quickly. Everything was building toward the moment when the enemy would reach the rear of the formation, the place where one gunner's readiness could influence the fate of every bomber ahead. The American formation pushed onward, holding its altitude as the terrain below shifted into territory defended by some of Germany's most experienced fighter wings. Reports gathered from earlier missions had warned that this corridor was watched closely. Radar stations monitored the approach of American bombers from the moment they crossed the coast, feeding information into a system that allowed fighter controllers to position their units with precision. For the crews inside the formation, the growing distance from friendly airfields meant something far more immediate. They were entering the zone where the Luftwaffe felt strongest. Bomber crews understood the structure of these defenses. The first lines were meant to track them. The second were meant to weaken them. The third were meant to destroy them. The Luftwaffe units near Brunswick belonged to that final tier. They were fast, aggressive, and trained to exploit the smallest disruption in an American formation. They studied bomber patterns just as American crews studied theirs. They knew where the airflow over AB-24 created a blind pocket. They knew where the armor was thick, where it was thin, and where the tail guns offered the most resistance. The formation that morning belonged to a group accustomed to long missions. They had flown deep into Germany before and knew how pressure built in stages. As they continued toward the target area, the steady discipline of the group held firm. Pilots locked onto their visual guides. Gunners remained alert. Navigators watched the route markers pass beneath them. But the crew also recognized that this stage of the mission was the point at which small failures could grow quickly. A loose formation meant an exposed bomber. An exposed bomber meant a gap. A gap meant an opening for fighters to strike the rear. The rear position carried weight beyond its placement. It shaped how the entire defensive grid functioned. German pilots understood that a strong tail gunner could throw off an entire attack run. They also understood that the tail was where vibrations, recoil, and long periods of tension tested every mechanical part. A gunner with a perfect field of fire meant nothing if the ammunition belt failed to feed. American crews drilled constantly to clear jams, but practice could not replicate the pressure of watching enemy aircraft close in while a belt refused to move. As the bombers approached the Brunswick region, the formation tightened again. The lead aircraft maintained the pace, while the rest adjusted their spacing. Escorts signaled their fuel limits, preparing to turn away. The moment the fighters banked off, the bombers felt the shift in responsibility. The defense now belonged entirely to the gunners, each turret covering a sector in a protective pattern that had been refined through thousands of mission hours. Inside the tail compartment of 1B-24, the gunner ran through a final series of checks. Ammunition aligned. Feed path clear. Charging handles responsive. He followed procedures taught during training but sharpened through experience. Every gunner understood that the difference between readiness and failure was often measured in seconds. A jammed belt during flight was not unusual. Clearing it under pressure was the challenge. The first German fighters were still miles away, but their climb patterns revealed intent. They rose in staggered chains, adjusting their positions relative to the American formation. Their goal was not to rush blindly. They approached with timing. They observed. They waited for the formation to commit deeper into the region where the air defenses favored them. Then they would strike from the rear, often in groups designed to split the attention of American gunners. Within the bomber formation, this tension grew quietly. The interphone carried short updates. Positions were confirmed. The tail gunner watched his arc, tracking anything that moved. Every crewman understood that the next phase of the mission would begin the moment the first German fighter appeared at the edge of visibility. The tail gunner knew he would be the first to see them and the first force to act. The mission's objectives mattered, but survival depended on the formation remaining unbroken. The 8th Air Force relied on this cohesion. A formation that held together could repel attacks and deliver its payload. A formation that buckled could suffer catastrophic losses before reaching the target. The rear gunners formed the backbone of that cohesion, absorbing the first blow so the rest of the group could stay aligned. As the German fighters closed the gap, the bombers had no room for error. Every mechanical system, every turret, every belt of ammunition had to perform without hesitation. The tail gunner, isolated in the narrow compartment, understood that his moment was approaching. He stayed focused on the horizon behind the formation, ready to defend not only his own aircraft but the entire chain of bombers that depended on his guns. Nothing else stood between the attackers and the American rear. Every mission demanded endurance, but the pressure placed on a tail gunner was unlike anything felt in the other positions. He sat alone, separated from the rest of the crew, facing the direction from which nearly every deadly attack would come. The isolation created its own weight. No one stood beside him. No one could help him if something failed. The interphone connected him to the crew, but the physical distance meant he carried the first burden of every engagement. When fighters appeared at the edge of the sky, he was the one who had to identify the threat, assess the angle, and open fire while the others waited for his report. In that moment, there was no buffer, no shared decision. His judgment shaped the reaction of the formation behind him. The pressure intensified when the bombers entered regions where escorts could not follow. The gunners knew this part of the mission well. It was where experience mattered more than nerves. A tail gunner needed calm hands and quick instincts, especially when fighters approached in coordinated patterns designed to break the formation. Under that pressure, a mechanical failure became more than a technical issue. It became a threat to every life ahead. When the belt jammed in the B-24 that day, the gunner felt the full weight of that responsibility settle on him. The enemy was closing, the formation depended on his guns, and the seconds were slipping away. Pressure at the tail was never theoretical. It arrived with speed, noise, and consequence. Despite the intensity of combat, much of a tail gunner's survival relied on routine. Before every mission, gunners inspected ammunition links, checked the alignment of their belts, cleaned the feed trays, and tested the recoil springs. These actions were small, repetitive, and often performed in silence while the crew prepared the aircraft. Routine created familiarity, and familiarity created confidence. The gunner knew the sound of a smooth feed, the feel of a properly seated belt, and the resistance that signaled friction along the tray. These rehearsed actions were not mundane. They were the difference between readiness and disaster. Inside the cramped tail position, routine extended to posture, breathing, scanning patterns, and trigger discipline. Gunners followed arcs, sweeping their field of vision methodically even when nothing moved. They checked the mirror angles. They confirmed the symmetry of their gun elevation. If routine broke, attention drifted. If attention drifted, the enemy gained an opening. Experienced gunners trusted their routines to anchor them during the moments when fear rose sharply. But no amount of preparation guaranteed perfection. Sometimes the links twisted. Sometimes vibration shifted the belt. Sometimes friction caught the line. On the mission over Brunswick, the tail gunner had performed every habitual step before takeoff. His routine had been correct. His checks had been thorough. Yet the belt still jammed at the worst possible moment, turning routine into urgency. What he had practiced calmly now had to be repeated under threat, with the entire formation counting on his ability to execute those familiar motions under pressure. The mechanical nature of air combat often remained invisible to those outside the aircraft. To the men who operated the guns, every detail mattered. The .50 caliber Brownings used by American bombers were robust, but they were not immune to issues caused by airflow, vibration, or ammunition imperfections. The tail position of a B-24 shook constantly. The fuselage flexed. Metal rattled. Cold air pushed through the thin skin of the aircraft. Each of these factors influenced how smoothly the ammunition belt fed through the guide. Gunners learned to respect the metal. They could feel when the gun cycled correctly. They could sense when the links hesitated. They listened to the rhythm of the mechanism the way an engineer listens to a working engine. When something disrupted that rhythm, the gunner often recognized it before the problem became visible. But knowing the issue was only the first step. Fixing it required speed, precision, and strength, all performed inside a space barely wide enough for a man to turn. In the moment the belt jammed, the tail gunner knew immediately that the metal was working against him. He felt the resistance through the charging handles. He saw the belt twist against the tray. He had only seconds to correct it before the incoming fighters closed to firing range. Every link, every hinge, every moving part dictated whether he could bring the guns back into action. The fight in that moment was not against the enemy. It was against the machine he depended on. No position on a heavy bomber carried the same exposure as the tail. The gunner sat at the far end of the aircraft, shielded by minimal armor, facing attackers who often fired the first shots of the engagement. Enemy pilots understood the importance of eliminating the tail gunner. Without rear defense, the formation's layered protection weakened immediately. A single successful pass could turn an intact bomber stream into a scattered, vulnerable group. The gunner knew this. He knew that when the fighters committed, they would aim for him first. Risk shaped every decision he made. When he leaned forward to adjust the feed. When he shifted his stance to clear the jam. When he took his hands off the triggers for even a second. He balanced survival with necessity. He could not abandon the guns to brace himself. He could not retreat from the window. His duty forced him to remain exposed to incoming fire while resolving the failure in front of him. On most missions, this risk was accepted without discussion. It was part of the role, part of the trust placed in every gunner who took the tail. But on the Brunswick mission, the risk sharpened instantly when the belt jammed. The gunner had to fix the problem while the attackers closed in, knowing that every second of delay increased the danger not only to himself but to the entire formation. Risk was not abstract. It was measured in distance, speed, and the narrowing space between survival and loss. American bomber formations survived because every gun, every turret, and every crewman contributed to a shared defensive network. No position functioned alone, even though each gunner fought within his own narrow space. The strength of the formation came from coordination, interlocking fields of fire, overlapping arcs, and the disciplined spacing that allowed dozens of aircraft to protect one another. The tail gunner's role was central to this system. His position anchored the rear defense, giving side and top turret gunners the time they needed to adjust their sights and track the incoming threat. When the formation flew deep without escort coverage, coordination became even more critical. German pilots studied the geometry of American defenses, searching for the brief moments when coordination weakened. The instant one gunner lost his field of fire, the pattern shifted. A single jam could cause a ripple across the group. That was the danger on the Brunswick mission. The tail gunner's silence, forced by the jammed belt, left a blind space that the attackers were trained to exploit. Without his initial burst to disrupt the approach, the fighters could enter more aggressively, placing pressure on the side gunners and opening angles normally denied to them. Coordination held the formation together, but when one point faltered, the entire structure strained. Mechanical issues were an unavoidable part of long-range missions. Aircraft aged quickly under combat conditions, and the constant vibration inside a B-24 tested every component. Belts twisted. links bent. Guides were down. A breakdown did not require negligence. It needed only a small misalignment at the wrong moment. The belt jam in the tail compartment that day reflected this reality. Nothing about the gunner's preparation had been flawed. The breakdown emerged from the harsh environment of flight, from the metal shaking against metal as the bombers pushed deeper into German airspace. The danger lay not in the malfunction itself but in its timing. A breakdown during calm flight was inconvenient. A breakdown during an active interception was deadly. German fighters counted on these failures. They attacked in waves to create stress, knowing stress increased the likelihood of mechanical errors. The gunner, trapped between duty and urgency, now had to restore his weapon under extreme pressure. Breakdown meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was exactly what the enemy sought to exploit. The moment the belt locked in place, the formation's entire rear defense thinned. The breakdown may have been mechanical, but its consequences were entirely tactical. Air combat hinged on timing. The speed of a fighter's approach, the interval between bursts, the seconds needed to clear a jam, all of these determined the outcome of engagements. When the German fighters began closing on the formation, the timing favored them. They approached during the window when escorts were turning back, choosing the moment when the American bombers were most exposed. The tail gunner knew this rhythm. He recognized the signs. The distance specks growing larger. The rapid compression of distance. The tightening formation ahead of him. Timing inside the tail compartment was equally unforgiving. The gunner had only seconds to diagnose the jam, free the belt, and return the guns to action before the attackers entered effective firing range. Every motion had to be exact. There was no room for hesitation. The jammed belt transformed routine movements into urgent ones. He pulled the belt free, realigned the links, and forced the charging handles forward with a precision shaped by training and experience. If he acted too slowly, the fighters would break through. If he rushed without thought, the malfunction could worsen. Timing was a narrow path, and the gunner had to follow it under the closest pressure he had ever faced. Experience gave gunners technical skill, but instinct kept them alive. Instinct shaped the speed of their reactions, the decisions made in fractions of a second, and the ability to focus under conditions that overwhelmed less seasoned crews. The tail gunner on the Brunswick mission relied on these instincts the moment the belt jammed. He did not freeze. He did not hesitate. He acted with the understanding that he had one chance to restore his guns before the formation came under direct attack. Instinct guided his hands even as the threat grew larger in the glass ahead of him. Instinct also shaped his understanding of when to fire. Gunners could not waste ammunition. They needed to disrupt the enemy, not simply pull the trigger. When the belt finally slid into alignment and the guns came back to life, it was instinct, not calculation, that determined the moment he squeezed the triggers. He knew the fighters were seconds from reaching the formation. He recognized the angle of their approach. Instinct allowed him to release a single burst at the precise moment when it could make the greatest difference. That burst would not only defend his own aircraft but change the fate of the entire group. By 10:42 a.m., the American bomber formation had entered the airspace over Brunswick. The city below remained hidden beneath the distant haze of wartime industry, while above, the sky vibrated with the hum of four-engined B-24s maintaining altitude in rigid formation. The tail gunner, stationed at the extreme rear of his aircraft, scanned the horizon with practiced precision. Every second counted. Every movement mattered. The first flashes of gray appeared, 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s rising from the left flank, climbing to intercept the exposed rear of the formation. The gunners in the tail positions immediately tracked the incoming fighters. The interphone crackled as reports of visual contact spread through the formation. From his isolated position, the tail gunner shifted slightly, gripping his twin .50 caliber Brownings. The ammunition belt, which had fed smoothly all morning, now resisted. A twisted link caught in the feed tray. The guns locked. Seconds that felt like minutes passed while he yanked and adjusted, the mechanism refusing to cooperate. The formation ahead maintained a tight box, but the German fighters pressed the advantage, their approach precise and coordinated. One Bf-109 broke slightly from the line, coming in fast at a descending angle aimed directly at the bomber's tail. The gunners in the side and top turrets readied their weapons, but the blind spot behind them left only the tail gunner to stop the initial attack. With each passing second, the fighter closed the gap, its machine guns primed to rip through the thin rear fuselage. Then the gunner felt it, a slight give in the belt, a movement that promised action. He yanked the charging handle, forcing the jam free, and the guns came alive with the familiar mechanical rhythm. The enemy pilot had reached effective range. The tail gunner had no room for error. Every shot fired now would dictate whether the fighter continued or veered off. His first burst struck with precision, tearing through the Bf-109's fuselage and hitting the engine. Smoke trailed as the fighter wavered, breaking its run and forcing the wingmen to adjust their attacks. The formation, shielded by this single burst, held its structure and altitude. The attack did not end with a single fighter. More planes closed in, 6 in total, diving from multiple angles. The tail gunner kept his focus, rhythmically clearing each belt, releasing controlled bursts at the points of highest threat. Each shot disrupted the German attack pattern, creating gaps that allowed the side and top gunners to engage effectively. Coordination, timing, instinct, all converged in the small space at the aircraft's rear. The jammed belt had nearly caused disaster, but its clearing had transformed urgency into decisive action. Amid the chaos, the tail gunner noticed another fighter approaching from the right. His hands moved automatically, guided by training and experience. He fired a short, rapid burst that struck the engine and fuselage, forcing the plane into evasive maneuvers. The rhythm of the attack shifted. The enemy pilots hesitated, unable to anticipate the ferocity of the defense. The formation's rear was no longer a weak point. It had become a lethal obstacle. The gunner's eyes scanned constantly. The remaining fighters attempted to exploit new angles, diving and climbing to find blind spots. But the disciplined American box, anchored by the sudden return of fire from the tail, absorbed each maneuver. Flak from below combined with the precise gunnery to slow the attacker's momentum. For nearly 5 minutes, the tail gunner and his fellow gunners held the line, executing bursts and corrections with relentless focus. Each fighter that withdrew or faltered increased the formation's chances of completing the mission intact. The sequence of events highlighted the interplay of human skill and mechanical reliability. A simple belt jam had the potential to expose dozens of airmen. Its clearing in the critical seconds allowed one gunner to dictate the pace of an entire engagement. The rear position, often underestimated, had proven decisive. The German fighters were forced into reactive behavior, their coordinated assault disrupted by a single individual who had combined instinct, precision, and courage. By 10:47 a.m., the immediate threat from the 6 fighters had diminished. The formation adjusted its spacing, the pilots signaling visual acknowledgement that the rear was secure. The tail gunner, physically tense and mentally exhausted, remained vigilant. The jammed belt had nearly cost the formation its cohesion, but the restored rhythm of fire had preserved it. In those few moments, he had shifted from vulnerability to control, demonstrating how a single action could influence the fate of dozens of men in the air above enemy territory. The engagement underscored the fragile balance of aerial combat. Every second, every mechanical function, and every decision intersected to create survival or catastrophe. The tail gunner's clearing of the jammed belt was more than a technical fix, it was the pivot upon which the mission teetered. The moment was intense, visceral, and decisive, and it would define not only that mission but the understanding of the tail gunner's critical role in the broader air campaign. As the smoke and debris from the disabled Bf-109 drifted away, the tail gunner remained fixed on the horizon. The remaining 5 German fighters circled, probing the formation for weaknesses. Their attacks were no longer unified. The single decisive burst had fractured their approach, forcing them to act independently. The tail gunner adjusted each ammunition belt with a practiced hand, maintaining a steady rhythm of fire that prevented any fighter from lining up a clean shot. Seconds now carried enormous weight. Too long, and the formation would be vulnerable. Too fast, and the guns could misfire. Each movement had to be measured, precise, and timed to the enemy's next maneuver. The German pilots attempted to coordinate a second wave. 2 fighters climbed to intersect the tail from slightly above, while another 3 angled in from the rear right, attempting to flank the bomber's weakened sectors. But the tail gunner anticipated their angles. Each burst he released was short, disciplined, and strategically aimed. One fighter's wing caught his fire, sending it into a steep dive. Another shuddered under the impact, forcing evasive rolls that disrupted the remaining attacker's timing. The formation remained intact. The tail, once the most vulnerable point, had become a defensive anchor. Inside the cramped compartment, the gunner's hands ached, sweat dripping from his brow despite the cold airflow. He had never faced a more critical sequence of shots. Every second demanded attention, every movement required skill honed through countless missions. The jammed belt, once a potential catastrophe, had become the catalyst for a controlled counterattack. His instinct dictated when to fire, his training dictated how, and the mechanical rhythm of the weapons ensured each round reached its target. At 10:50 a.m., the final German fighter on the tail line veered away, smoke trailing from its engine. The formation's integrity remained unbroken. Pilots in the lead and middle aircraft noted the gaps the enemy had attempted to exploit, but the coordinated, disciplined defense, anchored by a single tail gunner, had neutralized the threat. Flak from below, combined with concentrated fire from multiple turrets, forced the Luftwaffe fighters to retreat toward Brunswick, leaving the bombers unscathed in the final stretch toward their target. The critical moment crystallized the value of rapid problem-solving under pressure. A jammed belt could have meant disaster for dozens of men and multiple aircraft, but the gunner's response altered the battle in real time. Each attack that failed to reach the formation was a testament to the power of individual skill within a collective defense. The tail gunner had turned potential chaos into controlled, decisive action, ensuring the mission could proceed according to plan. Even after the immediate threat had passed, the formation remained vigilant. German fighters could regroup, and the threat was never fully eliminated until the bombers reached safer airspace. Yet the tail gunner's decisive burst had shifted the balance. The sequence of mechanical failure, rapid correction, and precise firing demonstrated a combination of human skill, instinct, and discipline rarely captured in mission reports but essential to survival. The incident would later be cited in debriefings and post-mission reports as a defining example of how the tail gunner's role was not merely supportive but pivotal. It illustrated that in the structured chaos of daylight bombing over Germany, one individual's moment of clarity could protect an entire formation. The mechanical jam, once a symbol of vulnerability, became a moment of triumph under extreme pressure, showing that survival depended not only on technology but on the disciplined, instinctive actions of trained personnel. By 10:55 a.m., the bomber formation resumed course, adjusting for minor altitude corrections while maintaining tight spacing. The tail gunner finally allowed himself a brief exhale, knowing the immediate threat had passed but understanding that vigilance remained essential. The Luftwaffe's presence still hovered in the broader region, yet the formation's cohesion, preserved by the skill of one gunner, meant the mission's integrity remained intact. What had begun as a near disaster transformed into a defining sequence of defense, highlighting how individual actions could influence outcomes far beyond a single aircraft. The bombers emerged from the engagement largely intact, a testament to the precision and discipline of the gunners and pilots. Damage reports confirmed that several aircraft had sustained light flak hits, but the immediate threat from the German fighters had been neutralized before catastrophic losses could occur. The tail gunner's quick reaction to the jammed belt had prevented what could have been a fatal breach in the rear of the formation. Crew debriefings emphasized the moment as critical. The formation remained cohesive, and the lead aircraft maintained its course toward the target with minimal disruption. Eyewitness accounts from other gunners highlighted the effect of a single defensive action on the group's overall survival. Pilots and turret operators recognized how the sudden burst of fire disrupted the attacking fighters' rhythm, forcing them to adjust their trajectories, break formation, and retreat in disarray. The tail gunner had effectively become the linchpin of the formation's defensive grid, transforming vulnerability into a controlled, coordinated countermeasure. Post-mission assessments by squadron leaders detailed the importance of mechanical reliability in combat. The belt jam had occurred at the worst possible moment, but the gunner's ability to clear it under extreme pressure reinforced the training procedures followed by the 8th Air Force. Maintenance logs and gun camera footage later confirmed that even minor mechanical issues could dramatically alter mission outcomes. The incident served as a reminder that success in aerial warfare was as dependent on disciplined human response as it was on firepower and formation tactics. Recognition of the tail gunner's role extended beyond the immediate crew. Squadron reports referenced the event as a defining moment of individual contribution within a large-scale operation. It became a case study in how mechanical failures, if addressed with composure and skill, could shift the balance of an engagement. Commanders highlighted that the gunner's actions preserved not only aircraft but the lives of dozens of airmen who might have otherwise been exposed to lethal attack. This survival also had psychological implications for the crews involved. Knowing that one individual could maintain the formation's integrity under extreme duress reinforced trust among crew members. Morale depended on such trust. Gunners and pilots alike drew confidence from observing how a potential disaster was averted by training, focus, and decisive action. It reinforced the value of every position in the bomber formation, particularly those that were often perceived as secondary or peripheral until moments of crisis proved otherwise. The mission continued to its target, the payload delivered successfully, and the return flight proceeded without further significant interference from enemy fighters. Debriefings and after-action reports captured the details of the engagement with precision, documenting the timing of the jam, the correction, and the subsequent effect on the German attack. These reports were circulated within the command structure as examples of both risk and successful mitigation, emphasizing the interplay between human skill and mechanical reliability in maintaining operational effectiveness. The Brunswick mission thus became an example of how a single moment of decisive action at the rear of a bomber could influence the outcome of an entire formation's engagement. The tail gunner's response not only safeguarded the aircraft immediately behind him but maintained the cohesion of the broader group, ensuring that the strategic objectives of the mission were met without catastrophic loss. The broader strategic impact of the mission became clear in the days following the Brunswick raid. The survival of the formation allowed the 8th Air Force to maintain its operational tempo, reinforcing the doctrine of daylight precision bombing. Every mission depended on tight formations and disciplined gunnery. This incident demonstrated the fragility of that system and the critical role of individual crew members in upholding it. Reports emphasized that even a single mechanical failure in the wrong position could compromise the entire operation. The tail gunner's quick reaction had a cascading effect, preventing not only immediate losses but also potential delays in future missions. Award recommendations and squadron commendations highlighted the extraordinary skill required to manage mechanical failure under fire. The crew received formal recognition for maintaining formation integrity, with the tail gunner specifically noted for his decisive action. Beyond formal accolades, the event became part of informal training discussions, illustrating how moments of high pressure demanded a combination of instinct, preparation, and calm problem-solving. Lessons drawn from the mission influenced how subsequent crews were trained to handle similar mechanical issues under duress, reinforcing the importance of readiness and adaptability. German records corroborated the effectiveness of the defensive action. Luftwaffe pilots reported disrupted attack runs and failed intercepts, noting that American formations often resisted assaults with greater efficiency than expected. The incident over Brunswick became a small but meaningful example of how the combination of individual skill and formation discipline could thwart even carefully coordinated enemy attacks. It reinforced the principle that no single aircraft operated in isolation. Each gunnery position, particularly the tail, played a pivotal role in the success or failure of the mission. The psychological and operational lessons extended beyond the mission itself. Crews internalized the knowledge that mechanical issues were inevitable but survivable if addressed with precision and focus. The event reinforced cohesion and trust among airmen, strengthening confidence in each other's capabilities. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners alike understood that every position mattered, and that readiness in critical moments could transform vulnerability into advantage. By the time the formation returned to England, the significance of the tail gunner's actions was firmly established. Squadron debriefings emphasized how his rapid response preserved not only aircraft but also the strategic integrity of the mission. Analysts and historians later cited the Brunswick raid as an example of individual contribution within large-scale operations, how one man, acting decisively, could alter the outcome of complex aerial engagements. The formation's survival underscored a central truth of the air war. Success relied on the seamless integration of human skill, mechanical reliability, and disciplined teamwork, with even minor disruptions carrying potentially catastrophic consequences. The mission concluded with no further losses, the bombers intact, and the target successfully struck. The lessons of that day extended far beyond Brunswick, shaping training, tactics, and appreciation for the critical roles each crew member played. A jammed belt, nearly a disaster, had become a defining moment, proving that courage, skill, and quick thinking could preserve both life and mission in the relentless arena of daylight bombing over Germany. The mission over Brunswick revealed the profound interplay between human skill and mechanical reliability in the air war. In the cramped tale of AB-24, one man's instincts, training, and composure determined the fate of dozens of airmen. A jammed belt could have ended in catastrophe, but quick thinking transformed it into an act of survival and defense. This moment illustrated a fundamental truth. In the chaos of combat, the smallest actions often carry the greatest consequences. Beyond the immediate tactical impact, the event reflected the broader nature of American air operations during World War II. Daylight precision bombing relied on discipline, coordination, and the courage of individuals committed to a shared purpose. Every gunner, every pilot, and every crew member had a role that could not be underestimated. The tail gunner's actions underscored how responsibility concentrated in a single position could ripple outward, preserving the cohesion of an entire formation. The Brunswick engagement also serves as a reminder of the human element in warfare. Technology alone does not secure victory. It is the combination of training, judgment, and instinct that transforms machinery into effective defense. In the space of a narrow tail compartment, with enemy fighters closing rapidly, a single burst of fire reshaped the battle. It demonstrated the quiet heroism often invisible to the broader public but essential to operational success. Ultimately, the mission's lesson extends beyond wartime heroics. It highlights resilience under pressure, the necessity of preparation, and the impact of decisive action at critical moments. The tail gunner's burst was more than a defensive maneuver. It was a defining instance where human agency directly influenced the course of events. It stands as a testament to the courage and skill of American airmen and to the delicate balance between risk, mechanical reliability, and instinct that characterized the aerial battles of World War II. In the end, the jammed belt was not a failure. It was a moment that revealed the extraordinary capacity of one individual to protect many. It became a story of precision, courage, and the relentless determination that allowed American formations to survive, strike, and continue their mission deep in enemy territory.